9. Veils of Woe. Beats and Peeping Toms 2. When Mandy strolls along the seashore and ruffians pepper her with pebbles, she is harmed. When Zahira crosses the park, veiled in Muslim garb, and hooligans mug her, she too is harmed. Many of us, devotees of John Stuart Mill, feel that people should be free to get on with their lives as they want, so long as they are not harming others, unless those others consent to their being harmed. This is Mill's harm principle, also known as the liberty principle. The ruffians and hooligans are inflicting harms without justification and without consent. They simply ought not to be doing what they do. Now for puzzling cases. Zahira is a modest woman, committed to Islam. Unbeknownst to her, when she undresses, a peeping Tom peeps upon her. She never knows about Tom and his peeping predilections, but is she not harmed? She loves pottering in her garden, but, when summer suns shine, she stays indoors. Mandy, her neighbor, sunbathes topless. Zahira finds it offensive, yet is she harmed? Zahira knows that Mandy leads a sexually disreputable life, dismissive of religions, prophets and holy scriptures. Is Zahira harmed because of what she knows goes on next door, albeit veiled by curtains? Mandy basks under the sun, on a public beach, topless, where others too are topless. Here, she is peppered by frequent glances from men who just happen to stroll nearby. They make her uncomfortable. Is she harmed? A few fundamentalist Muslims, including Zahira, and evangelical Christians, for once all united, parade along the beach. They wave placards denouncing atheists, public nudity and sexual immorality. More harms for Mandy. She is upset by some shouts of hellfire for her friends, family and herself. How could they even think such things? Mandy gives up on the beach, Zahira gives up on the parade. They take the train back home, acknowledging each other awkwardly. In the carriage, they are peppered by the beats of leaking MP3 players, jingles from mobile phones and worse. At home, they cannot escape adjacent building works drillings during the day. And, some nights, their very different thoughts and sleep are disrupted by car alarms and burglar alarms, all false alarms. Are they harmed? On the next sunny afternoon, Mandy returns to her garden to sunbathe, but then feels uneasy at upsetting her Muslim neighbor. Her Muslim neighbor, now indoors, feels somewhat uneasy at her condemnation of Mandy. Where do harms begin and end? Mill is often criticized for not defining harm, but a definition is unlikely to help. Were an accurate definition given, then it would feature the same fuzzy uncertainties that we already find in applying harm. In the end, we need to consider cases. We need to consider them, case by case. Zahira knows nothing of Tom's peeping. It is not necessary, though, to experience harms to be harmed. People are knocked unconscious and die. They are harmed, yet unaware. True, being peeped upon is not a harm like that. Some insist that it is a harm only if discovered, but that is unconvincing. Were Zahira to find out about the peeping, she would be distressed. Why? Because of what she found out about, namely being peeped upon. Were that not harmful, why would she be distressed at finding out? Zahira's interests extend beyond what she experiences. It is in her interests, given her feelings about privacy, not to be peeped upon. A compelling and similar example concerns betrayal. If you are betrayed, you are harmed even if the betrayal remains undiscovered and has no effect on your life's progress. We are not, of course, remotely suggesting that non-experienced harms are typically as bad as experienced ones. To be peppered by gunshot is usually radically worse than being in receipt of some secretive peeping. What of the distress that Zahira suffers simply in knowing of, to her mind, the unsavory activities behind closed curtains next door? In the peeping case, although Zahira experiences no distress, she is being used by Tom for his peeping pleasure. Mandy's activities, though, do not make use of Zahira. Zahira's distress results because of her belief that such activities are immoral, and her belief is her responsibility. Perhaps we should, then, disregard, or at least treat lightly, harms, assuming that they should even be considered as harms, that rest solely on victims holding certain moral or religious beliefs. On this view, we should treat lightly Mandy's distress at the placards as also certain religious believers' distress at some pop operas, cartoon caricatures and prophets' names assigned to teddy bears. The reasoning just given may suggest that privacy violations should merit little concern, for the possible distress at being peeped upon, or learning that private intimate information has been publicly circulated, presumably needs victims to hold the belief that such exposure is wrong. We should remember, though, that privacy violations sport the morally disreputable feature of the victims being used by the violators for their own satisfactions, without the victim's consent. Earlier, in Chapter 1, we met Kant with his emphasis on the moral importance of respecting people, of not using them solely as means to our ends. In contrast to those who suffer privacy violations, it is not at all clear that those distressed by placards, cartoons, and teddy bears' names, are being used in some disreputable way by those who cause the distress, though, of course, sometimes that may be the intention. As for disturbances by beat music and the like, we may be generous and agree that the racketeers, so named because of their disturbances, were not intent on deliberately irritating Mandy and Zahira. Had they been so intent, then Mandy and Zahira would have been being used, akin to Zahira being peeped upon for sexual pleasure. Maybe the racketeers are merely living their lives as they want, just as the two women are trying to live theirs. Should we simply accept and be tolerant? Mandy's lifestyle offends Zahira, but only because of Zahira's religious beliefs. Do the racketeers affect Mandy and Zahira only because of the women's beliefs? Well, no. Loud noises and even quiet repetitive noises, think a dripping taps, cause discomfort, stress and on edge feelings in many people. Indeed, a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease seems to be associated with certain levels of noise pollution. Such harms do not appear to be dependent on belief. But the racketeers may also feel tense, if deprived of their beats and mobile burblings. Perhaps they too could suffer some physical harms, if repressing what they want to do. Lifestyles clash. Is that all we can say, or are there not some relevant differences here? Suppose our starting point is people sitting on the train, traveling from A to B. Let us add some activities. Mandy reads. That usually affects no one else. She falls asleep. That usually affects no one else. Non-racketeers could listen to music turned down. That would affect no one else. Harms and disputes arise because the racket is being inflicted on unwilling others, unnecessarily so. Perhaps the morally relevant feature here is the physical one-way imposition of harms, an imposition that offends the Golden Rule, a version from Confucius being, do not do to others what you would not like yourself. We met a version earlier in Chapter 3. Even if this glittering rule is accepted, it does not follow that it should take highest priority in our moral thinking. Further, it says nothing about what counts as doing the same. Those who enjoy loud noise or leering at others may not mind loud noise and leers in return. True, we may avoid that objection by arguing that at the very least those who harm others probably do not want to be harmed themselves, but that returns us to our puzzlement about the nature and extent of harms. Displayed above are some factors that are relevant to the question of which harms are morally significant. 2 points should be added. The first is, as Mill notes, even when some activities are harmful, they may rightly be permitted. Car driving leads to accidents, but traveling benefits are taken to outweigh those harms. The overall benefit of free expression may well outweigh the distress caused to Zahira and Mandy. We should, though, be cautious when told that because certain benefits clearly outweigh certain harms, it follows that therefore some specified harmful means to those benefits are justified. Other possible means need to be taken into account. Here is an example. Burglary prevention is, no doubt, of overall benefit. But it follows neither that burglar prevention through inefficient noisy alarms is overall beneficial nor that there may not be better means of prevention. After all, those benefits arguably could be achieved by the fun of neon lights announcing across the property, "Help! Help! I'm being burgled," or, more seriously, direct alerts to the police. We may even question the necessity of much building works noise that distresses many people, reducing their quality of life. Research could probably lead to effective silencers or quiet laser equipment. Some may immediately respond that all this would be too expensive or impractical, forgetting how over the decades authorities had made similar claims about the expense or impracticality of national health services, lead-free petrol and banning cars from city centers. The list could go on. Where there's a will, as they say. The second point to note is, let us not forget courtesy, grace, fellow feeling and goodwill. Muslims, in non-Islamic countries, who demand the right to wear the niqab in public may lack sensitivity to those countries, traditions and ways of living. In response, it may be claimed that prohibitions on religious garb are disrespectful of the religious. Please see Chapter 19. Perhaps deep and troubling divides exist when religion enters the fray, but not with other frays. To return to non-religious examples, for people to insist that they should be free to do whatever they want, by way of leaking beat music, dirty shoes on public transport seats, for bars and media organizations to promote excessive drinking and loutish culture, is to display basic discourtesies and ill will. Arguably, many individuals who do these things know no better, or, and for an additional sad reflection, have nothing better to do. Are these last points a manifestation of grey beard and age, or of some minimal sensitivity that many people quietly endorse and many others would endorse once seriously reflecting on not harming others? 10. Someone else will. Jobs are not easy to come by in Little Rock, out in Midwest America, so imagine how pleased Goodman was when offered employment by the local sheriff. His luck was on the up, or so he thought, until the sheriff said a little more. "You see," said the sheriff, "what we really need is a professional hangman. You're ideal for the job, in view of your skill with ropes and knots and shortly, I hope, nooses." Goodman gulped. Yes, he wanted a job. He had a family to support, but unlike so many of Little Rock's citizens, the Little Rockians, he was opposed to hanging. He was a man of principle, at least on this matter. "No, I really can't take the job," stammered Goodman. "It's a pity, but I'm deeply opposed to the death penalty. It's as simple as that." "Look," replied the sheriff, "I respect your view, though it's not mine, but if you don't take the job, I'll have to offer the position to someone else. Someone else will do the hanging. So, what have you achieved by your refusal?" "Steadfastness to principle," replied Goodman, with a sad expression, wondering how to break the news to his family that he had rejected employment so well paid. "That's not much of a principle, if it makes you look so sad," beamed the sheriff. "Anyway, what of your other principles, your duties such as feeding and educating your children?" I know. Principles clash, but there are some things I cannot bring myself to do. Before and after the hangings, I'd have nightmares. They'd show me how morally wrong it would be. That's just a psychological problem of yours, Goodman, but your duty is to your family, and, to repeat, if you don't take the job, someone else will get it. Nothing is gained by your standing high and mighty on principle. In fact, between you and me, I really want you for the job, as I know that you'd treat those awaiting execution humanely, whereas the other contender for the job, Badman, would taunt the prisoners as well as eventually hanging them pretty painfully. That's another reason for you to accept. Come on, take the job. Should Goodman go against his principle and take the executioner's job? Someone else will, if I do not, is often an attempted excusing factor, both for doing what we think that we ought not to do and for failing to do what we think we ought. For example, a woman has fainted on the railway platform. We are in a rush. Well, someone else will look after her, we reflect, as we dash by. What should we advise Goodman to do? Looking at the dilemma solely in terms of consequences, outcome, regarding overall benefits, Goodman, it would seem, should accept the sheriff's offer. It would help his family, it would make things not quite so bad for those on death row. Those factors should outweigh his discomfort. He may even feel good about himself, something of a martyr, in overcoming his principle. True, other factors could be cast into the calculation, factors pointing to the opposite conclusion. For example, Badman may have an even bigger family to support. So far, our reasoning has been directed at likely consequences. Furthermore, if Goodman's declining the job would lead others to reconsider their support for the death penalty, aiding its eventual prohibition, and were the prohibition to lead to a more flourishing society, then, still on consequential grounds, Goodman would be right in his refusal. But let us assume that, on straightforward consequential grounds, it would be better for Goodman to accept the sheriff's offer. Could anything still be said in support of Goodman's refusal? This is where we may focus on what sort of person Goodman wants to be, and how integral his principle is to his life. Could Goodman live with himself, live with his conscience, if he allowed himself, as he sees it, to dirty his hands by being executioner? Perhaps staying faithful to his principle, regardless of overall consequences, carries its own moral weight. An immediate response is that Goodman, in declining the job, is being self-indulgent, putting his own sense of moral well-being above helping his family. Yet is that a fair riposte? Can morality demand that Goodman sacrifice his integrity? Goodman has to live with himself. Perhaps that factor, though, of what makes for Goodman's flourishing life, could simply be entered into a more nuanced consequentialist calculation, with Goodman's sense of integrity given extra weight. The above consequentialist approach to morality rests on a detached perspective, a perspective that stands outside Goodman's particular circumstances. It seeks objectivity, taking into account the effects of the proposed action on Goodman, on the prisoners, on Badman, and W.D. so forth. Now, Goodman may picture himself lacking certain attachments. He becomes unswayed by his wife, blind to images of hanging victims, but his decision and resultant action needs, it seems, the motivational umph of his actual feelings, worries and concerns. One question, then, is whether morality, understood as totally detached, could ever provide that umph. That apart, morality, it may be argued, demands special regard for certain attachments that Goodman has, his loyalties, relationships and what matters to him. Goodman, in making his choice over the job, is making himself. His motivation may arise from his seeing himself as a man of firm principle against the death penalty, or as a man devoted to his family such that he will sacrifice certain principles for that family. In taking the job, though, he could be accepting himself as a hypocrite or coward, unprepared to uphold his principle. What moves Goodman, and what should move all of us, are our projects and what we see as giving moral sense to our lives. Someone else will, if I do not, in itself, should carry little weight when we consider how we ought to live our lives, well, usually so. Similarly, others do it, so I'll do the same, also ought to carry little weight. Consider how some parents lie about their religious faith or their home address in order to get their children into the better school. Well, everybody else does. Insurance claimants overclaim with similar attempted justification. That others do is not sufficient to shield us from condemnation or praise, for we have still chosen to be that sort of person who does as others do. Where does this leave us over Goodman and the job offer? Well, we can discuss with Goodman, we can draw attention to factors unnoticed. In the end, the decision is his. He has to live with what he decides. He ought not to expect a detached answer which he must follow as a puppet follows the pull-all. Of course, of the strings, the puppet being no agent, no person, he could choose to behave as if a puppet, but that also is then his personal choice. When important dilemmas arise, such as our dilemma for Goodman, there is a lot to be said for D. H. Lawrence's injunction, find your deepest impulse and follow it. Mind you, reflecting on some people and their deepest impulses, there is also a lot to be said for not recommending such action. It may appear, all very well, to encourage people to realize themselves, to be authentic, true to their beliefs, desires and projects, but sometimes it is far from well. Indeed, it may not be well at all. Certain deepest desires and commitments ought not to be realized. Reflect on the many horrors, lives trampled upon or destroyed, horrors caused by certain powerful leaders with deep convictions, being true to themselves. Evaluation is needed of the content of the beliefs, projects, attachments, for only some are worthy of promotion. The puzzle is often, which ones?